Many people think that the notion of beauty is just the opposite of ugly and simply means attractive, that it's a pleasure to look at, or tasteful in terms of shape, color, and being well proportioned. In this context, beauty has an objective side, its inherent properties, and a subjective side, the feelings evoked in us by something beautiful, for example, a building. In this sense, beauty does indeed lie in the eye of the beholder. However, there's much more to beauty than this. Historically, beauty is connected to aesthetics, which is a set of philosophical principles concerned with the nature of beauty and how we are to appreciate it. Now, the word aesthetics comes from the Greek aesthetikos, concerning perception, meaning how we come to understand reality through our senses. Philosophers over the centuries have written in various ways about beauty. For the Stoics in ancient Greece and Rome, for example, the Greek Chrysippus or the Roman Cicero, beauty is not just concerned with what's attractive, but is connected with the good or the sublime, that is, what's related to the sacred, what's related to our quest for ultimate meaning, and what's connected to our integrity. For example, for Chrysippus, the Greek philosopher, beauty referred to proper proportion and to the harmony between the parts and the whole. For the early Christian theologian, Augustine of Hippo, influenced by Stoicism as he was, aesthetics was closely related to what he calls harmonia, the fitting order of reality that reflects the beauty of God. Augustine connects beauty to virtue, particularly to what he calls the good. And this was further developed by the medieval Christian philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica, where beauty embraces wholeness, integritas, harmony, consonantia, and radiance, claritas, all of them, according to Aquinas, expressive of God's reality. At the heart of the arts and of design, including architecture, is the power of the image. That is, the architect, the designer, or the architect creates a material expression of a deeper reality and communicates this via imagery. Observers, such as the rest of us, receive meaning through our imagination, evoked by the imagery. In other words, imagery, for example, the design of a building, has the capacity to touch the spiritual depths of our human perception beyond the limits of mere observation or description. In this context, what we mean by a good building and what it means to build well is not merely about efficiency or looking good, but should also be related to moral and spiritual values. And this brings me to the complicated and sometimes contentious question of what constitutes an iconic building. So what are iconic buildings? To be iconic surely means more than simply provoking amazement at design innovation or at the overwhelming size of a building that materially dominates my skyline. To my mind, being iconic also reflects motive and purpose. So a genuine question concerns whether the notion of iconic is more appropriate in relation to the design of an individual building or of a locality, for example, a city square or piazza, that reinforces the value of people and of a shared public life, rather than expresses social or economic domination. Thoughtful commentators, and hopefully also architects, suggest that apart from being impressively designed or highly visible, iconic structures should somehow act as collective symbols of true place. However, critical questions remain. To what extent do contemporary so-called iconic buildings, particularly if they are commercial buildings, express the value of place identity and the value of people? In contrast to the commercial nature of many contemporary iconic buildings, it's worth underlining that we misinterpret the historic role of religious buildings, such as city churches, if we link them only to explicitly religious activities. Throughout history, such buildings have also frequently been spaces for social connection and community definition. It's worth remembering that in the European Middle Ages, there was a significant permeability between religious spaces, such as a city church, and the surrounding streets. The sacred was not rigidly separated from the everyday. In the Middle Ages, churches were often the only significant public buildings and were therefore multi-purpose. There were markets held in the nave. Churches hosted community feasts. They provided meeting spaces for the craft guilds, and even in some places acted as hospitals. A good contemporary example of a religious building that crosses the boundary between the sacred and the everyday is the famous London Church of St. Martin in the Fields, which sits on one of the city's iconic public squares, Trafalgar Square. St. Martin's is closely involved in social justice issues at home and overseas. The building continues to offer multi-purpose spaces as a creative expression of the ancient tradition that I mentioned. Apart from regular religious worship, the church also hosts regular music concerts and art exhibitions. And as some of us know, between 2006 and 2008, there was a major renovation project involving the church and surrounding buildings. There's now a popular cafe in the crypt, and most strikingly, St. Martin's, with its surrounding buildings, offers an important centre for homeless people with multiple facilities. This mixture at St. Martin in the Fields is a contemporary example of the role that an accessible and non-exclusive sacred space may play in a major public square in a cosmopolitan world city. Now, I want to end my talk with a brief reflection on medieval Gothic cathedrals, such as Chartres, which we can now see. That's the main view down the nave. Many of these cathedrals survive today. Gothic architecture is an artistic form with powerful spiritual and theological resonances. The original theory was overtly spiritual. In these buildings, paradise was evoked and expressed in material terms through the design, the layout, and the artwork. To enter such a great church as Chartres Cathedral was to be transported into a transcendent realm by the space, the light, and the color. The architecture of medieval cathedrals was a microcosm of the universe, was meant to be, and sought to express a peaceable oneness between God and material creation. Here, an idealized cosmic harmony was portrayed in the material structure. Medieval people entering these buildings were transported into a vision of heaven on earth by the juxtaposition of vast spaces such as the one we are looking at in Chartres, and intimate spaces, little side chapels, and by the progressive dematerialization of the walls with a sea of glass and a flood of light. During the 12th century, someone called Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis in Paris was one of the greatest early theorists of Gothic architecture. For Suger, a church building was a gateway to heaven and therefore needed in its structure to express a transcendent vision. At their best, the great medieval cathedrals portrayed another dimension of human life, a movement through space from earth to heaven. I just want to mention one example, and that's the medieval cathedral in Norwich. This has 250 roof bosses, which run down the center of the cathedral, vaulting from the choir back through the nave and ending at the west door. The bosses portray a history of salvation, beginning with the fall and ending with the final judgment and paradise. It's significant that the fall is nearest to the high altar, and the final judgment and paradise are nearest to the exit through the west door. As a visual pilgrimage, it moves from the most sacred part of the cathedral, the high altar, to a door back onto the city streets. And it's not too far-fetched to suggest that this probably represents the viewpoint of the wealthy Norwich merchant class who funded much of the cathedral's decoration. The direction of the visual journey back to the main entrance suggests, and I'm sure this is what they wanted, that the city itself should be seen as sacred space. Interestingly, a famous feature of the great medieval Chartres Cathedral, which has captured the imagination of people who are not overtly religious, is the Labyrinth, which you can now see. This is the labyrinth etched on the floor of the nave at the rear, and originally intended to be an image both of a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for people who were unable to actually undertake that pilgrimage, and the pilgrimage of life towards our eternal destiny. Now, versions of this labyrinth design appear in other medieval cathedrals, either in a form like the one at Chartres, which enables you to walk through it in meditation, or, for example, at the city of Lucca in Italy, where it's a miniature on the wall outside the cathedral door. So somebody about to enter the cathedral in Lucca could, and indeed can still, because it's still there, trace the labyrinth design with a finger before entering the building. But the walking labyrinth of Chartres, which we're looking at, is nowadays reproduced around the world, not just in centers of spirituality, but also in public parks and in city squares, and I've seen several of these in the States. To walk the labyrinth cultivates attentiveness and stillness, and also symbolizes a quest for ultimate enlightenment. Now, because in a labyrinth, as opposed to a maze, there are no false avenues or dead ends, our walking through it always arrives at the center. Now, it's widely recognized that there was a diversity of aesthetics, concepts of beauty, and theological symbolism in the age of medieval Gothic architecture. This is emphasized in the illuminating study of medieval art and beauty by Umberto Eco, the famous Italian philosopher. Gothic cathedral space has been characterized, as we'll see in the next slide, as, among other things, dematerialized and spiritualized. In this way, the architecture expresses the limitlessness of an infinite God through the soaring verticality of the arches and of the roof vaults. These are a deliberate antithesis to human scale. We should also, and we can see this in this particular slide, also note the medieval fascination with the symbolism of numbers. So, for example, the conventional three-story elevation of Gothic church architecture, which we can see here, the main arcade, which is at the bottom, what's called the triforium, which is a kind of passageway in the middle, and the clerestory, i.e. the windows at the top, can't be explained simply by advances in medieval engineering. For example, Abbot Suger, already mentioned, drew explicit attention to its Trinitarian symbolism, that this three-level design is meant to point to the God as Trinity, three persons in one. However, what's interesting is that later Gothic church buildings, such as the famous King's College Chapel in Cambridge, are notable for another feature that was typical of their later period. The stone walls that support King's College Chapel were reduced to a minimum and replaced by vast expanses of glass. The biblical stories portrayed in the stained glass windows taught the worshipper a great deal about the Christian doctrine of God, the Christian understanding of creation, and the Christian understanding of what it means to talk about salvation. However, there was also a sense in which colored glass and its patterned effect on the stonework of the interior of the building expressed what's being called a metaphysics of light. God was proclaimed both as the one who dwelt in inaccessible light, yet whose divine light also lights up the world. A key feature of the theology of Abbot Suger and of medieval churches in general is that the material world is not incidental, but is necessary in order to draw humankind upwards to the heavenly realm. In the mind of someone like Abbot Suger, a church building should not only be adequate for public worship, but should also evoke wonder and point beyond itself to God's eternal dwelling place. In this way of seeing things, the church building is a doorway or an access point. Its beauty and harmony is represented not simply by its design, its architectural coherence, and its artwork, but by the degree to which it enables us to gain access to a spiritual realm. This is the true beauty, the harmonia of a religious building such as a Gothic cathedral like Chartres.